Hello and welcome to folks who are just now joining us for our Human Rights in the Environment event. We are so excited to see y'all on Earth Day 2021. It's a lot going on nationally, internationally, right now with environmental policy, and we just feel really honored that you would tune in with us to share this time. In just a few moments, we'll be kicking off our fireside chat with both Ed Gray and Dr. Brad Klein. And we would invite folks to utilize the chat function to ask questions of our panelists. We will be saving some space and time at the end of tonight's events for audience questions. So thankful to have you with us. And on that note, Neha, I'll turn it over to you to begin by introducing Dr. Klein, and I will introduce Ed Gray.
Perfect. Like Hib said, thank you all so much for joining. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Brad Klein, who is the Associate Director of the SMU Human Rights Program. He is a human rights and environmental justice scholar activist specializing in critical pedagogy, ethical leadership, and social change. Brad has been involved in human rights education for his entire career, having helped build and lead programs at the high school, undergraduate, and graduate levels. He frequently consults with educators and administrators on best practices in human rights education. He has been involved with activism, education, entrepreneurship, policy, and research efforts throughout the United States and in many global locations. His areas of expertise include American exceptionalism, critical and engaged pedagogy, and diversity education, environmental and food justice, ethical leadership development, implicit bias, indigenous rights, interreligious dialogue, intersectionality, neurodecolonization, social change theory and practice, systemic privilege and oppression, and worldview formation. Klein holds a doctorate in religious and theological studies with a concentration in religion and social change from the University of Denver and Iliff School of Theology, master's degrees in peace and justice studies and pastoral care and counseling from the University of San Diego, and a bachelor's degree in sociology and theology from Marquette University. He received the SMU M Award, which is the highest university recognition in 2020.
Thank you for making all that up. I'll pay you later.
What a mouthful. Yeah, clearly none of our panelists or fireside chat experts have made it easy for us. All of them have lengthy accomplishments. I should note that I had to trim down Ed Gray's bio. There is even more remarkable work that Ed has done. You're getting the highlights version through this bio. I am super pleased tonight to have Ed Gray joining us. Ed was born in Washington, D.C., but is an alum of DISD. And as a high school student, Ed was already working as a congressional intern in Washington, D.C. Ed began his matriculation at Southern Methodist University in 1986, where he majored in sociology and minored in political science. During that time, he simultaneously began his career as a civic volunteer in the cities of Dallas, Arlington, Grand Prairie, as well as the Arlington School District and the Grand Prairie Independent School District. Ed's community involvement led him back to SMU, where he volunteered as an alumni mentor to African-American students. Today, Ed is currently enrolled in the Doctoral Liberal Studies program, where he is researching environmental rights and civil rights. Gray is currently exploring environmental inequities in Dallas's communities of color and its access to environmental justice. Ed Gray remains active in the Dallas community. He is a husband, father of 4, and a grandfather of 3. Ed currently has been employed as the telecommunication at both the telecommunication and information company AT&T for over 40 years. He is a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated and is active as a political consultant through Ed Gray and Associates. He is a former political commentator on WFAA's Inside Texas Politics and currently hosts his radio show, The Commish Radio Show, and writes his weekly news, which are all published throughout the United States. Ed, it is a pleasure to have you joining us tonight.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Without further ado, I want to give up the floor to Ed and Brad as they talk us through this intersection of human rights and environmental justice. We are thrilled to have your insights and expert voices guiding our time tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hope. And feel so honored to be able to have this conversation with Ed and with all of you. Ed's work, I was telling him beforehand that I'm going to brag on him a little bit because he deserves it. Ed's work looking at environmental justice issues in Dallas is truly groundbreaking. And it really, the thing that's really stuck out to me from working with Ed is, when you look at other major cities in the South, Houston, New Orleans, there's been some work on environmental justice that goes deep, but Dallas is an unexplored territory. And so Ed is really breaking this ground for the first time and is, I would say, the world leader, the world expert on this topic. And so to have him in conversation with us tonight is really, really a special thing. And Ed, I was thinking, I found a quote earlier. I was reading an article earlier this week, and I wanted to read it to kind of just get us kicked off around a general theme that we can kind of maybe narrow in further from there, if that works for you. The quote is from Winona LaDuke, the Anishinaabe leader and activist, former Green Party vice presidential candidate, just a wonderful person. So she says, and so as I reflect on the question of how to be a good ancestor, I reflect on intergenerational accountability. How do I account for my behaviors and decisions to my ancestors and to my descendants? We've been hearing a lot about accountability in the news recently. So that struck me, but this idea of intergenerational, those who have come before, those who are coming after. And I think from Winona LaDuke's perspective, also widening our sense of ancestry beyond our biological relatives or our family of origin to the non-human beings, the places that we inhabit. When you hear those words, Ed, what comes to mind for you in the work that you do?
Well, thank you for posing that question. The first thing comes to mind to me is that intergenerational accountability is studying where I came from. When my family moved here from Washington, D.C., we were zoned, if you will, into a segregated area of town in Dallas. And from that zoned area of town, we experienced environmental injustice. And I feel that it's somewhat, I brought this full circle because I used to play in the area in which I breathed in the toxic fumes in 1967. And now it's 2021. I'm bringing it back to the forefront of how we can change this to beings that are not born yet into 2035 and 2040. That is the accountability that we bring to this study, and also we bring to this endeavor. And simply put, we do have a responsibility, not only to this generation that we are living with now, but to those generations that are yet to come. And that's the intergenerational accountability. We all breathe the same air. We all breathe and drink. Well, we all breathe the same air and we all drink the same water, and we all have that accountability to make it last for future generations.
And I think, I've really been struck from the beginning, realizing that this work that you do is really deeply embedded in you, like you said, from the time when you were a child. And I think for me as well, I can remember growing up and so much of that environment and the what I saw, what I had access to, what I didn't have access to, has shaped a lot about why I do what I do. Could you maybe speak a little bit more? I mean, I know some of this story, but I think our audience would be really interested to hear kind of that trajectory when you look back. You were experiencing Cadillac Heights, and how does your work, how is it fueled by that experience of, this place, you're from here, you grew up here?
That's the amazing thing about when you're writing something about Dallas. Most people, when they read or hear anything about Dallas, they're listening, and they're also reading things from people who are not native Dallasites.
Yeah.
And very few Dallasites have put pen to paper, or shall I say, made it digitized, where they're able to see the history of their own city. And that's the importance of this dissertation, is that it brings to mind the Cadillac Heights, which is located in the Oak Cliff section of town. It also brings to mind West Dallas, where you see the smokestacks on Interstate 30, where they still have the ground is still littered with the toxic fumes and lead poisoning, that the lead poisoning has polluted 2 generations of Americans dating back to the 1950s. This is what we're talking about. When you look at this perspective of being, and I'll go circle back to intergenerational accountability and also being a Dallasite. This is one of the things that we have to put forth because Dallas has a history of hiding its dirt, whether it's toxic or whether or not it's just plain old dirt. It has a history of hiding it. And what makes this dissertation prevalent and what makes it important, shall I say, is the fact that it brings to mind that we have a lot to overcome in Dallas through its segregated policies and also through its environmental inequities.
And I know, so much of your work revolves around this general idea of environmental justice, but also environmental racism and a term that we've talked a lot about, environmental colonialism. For those who maybe aren't familiar, how would you define anyone, all of those things? What is it? What is that? Why is it a problem? Why is it worth writing a dissertation on?
Environmental colonialism is just as important as how I landed at Southern Methodist University. Nobody in the southern sector of Dallas even thinks about going to SMU because it's way up there. We often look at the newscast, and the newscast always talks about the southern sector, sort of like it's a colony, if you will, sort of like it's in a Cold War state in which you have the northern sector and the southern sector, and you have the Berlin, and Berlin you have the Russian sector, and you also have the American sector. And this is environmental colonialism. The people of Oak Cliff, if you look at a map, and you look at the map, and I've defined Oak Cliff as Oak Cliff, South Dallas, and West Dallas. West Dallas is actually south of the Trinity River. If you look at a map of our town of Dallas, our city of Dallas, most of the industrial sites are located south of the Trinity River. So that means most of the people who are breathing in this toxic air and most of the people who have problems with food deserts, that's a form of environmental justice as well, they're located south of the Trinity River. And that's how we viewed environmental colonialism. The importance, again, of this dissertation, and I like to use primary sources in it, is the fact that a lot of people in Oak Cliff are somewhat, they look at people that are outsiders as them. And there's not a trust factor involved with other people that are not them. Yeah. And that is how I'm able to get into the Oak Cliff sector, so to speak, and make this work. One thing I like to bring to mind, and it's not in this dissertation, Sand Branch is a community in southern Dallas. It's an unincorporated community. They have no running water in Sand Branch. The largest community, well, not the largest community, if you will, the fourth largest metropolitan area in the United States is Dallas, Texas. And you have a large percentage of its citizens in the neighborhood that don't have any running water. That's like living in a Navajo nation, which 80% of the people there don't have electricity and don't have water as well. So therefore, we have African Americans that are living in a subpar region of Dallas, and that's environmental colonialism.
Yeah, something you said reminds me. In one of my classes, I talk a little bit about food deserts, which there are some scholars who say we should really get rid of that term, food deserts, and talk about food apartheid, because a desert is a naturally occurring ecosystem, and it gives the sense that this is kind of like a natural thing, that access to healthy and culturally relevant food is just something that happened. Well, no, just like apartheid happened, it was made artificially by people for specific political and economic reasons. And certain people have it and certain people don't. But anyway, the clip that I use is from, it's a news clip from the nightly news on one of the major, I think it was like the NBC affiliate here in Dallas. It was just a few years ago. And they were doing a profile on Paul Quinn, the farm at Paul Quinn College. And it's a very praiseworthy piece talking about the wonderful efforts that are going into this farm. But at the very end, the anchor comes back and she says, what a wonderful thing for those people there.
Mm.
And just that small little linguistic twist around, I mean, Paul Quinn is located in Dallas. It's not those people there. This is us here. But yet that kind of sense that this is them, we are us, and it's a totally separate thing. And going back to the SMU connection you brought up, you know, I think about, as I sit here in my office and I look out over our beautiful green lawn and landscaping, you know, how many students may come to Dallas for SMU to get the great education that's available here and enjoy this, you know, beautiful place, but may never have any connection, let alone any idea of what happens in the Southern sector, like you were saying. It also reminds me of, I saw the SMU's Instagram post for Earth Day, I think today, and it said, you know, this is our favorite place on Earth, and it is a wonderful place. But it also makes me think about all the chemicals in the water that go into making this lawn as green as it is, in a place that, you know, that the middle of Texas, and I'm in the middle of summer in Dallas, Texas. You know, the grass doesn't look like that naturally. You know, all these kind of little things that help us to forget the place that we are at, and what it means for us to be embedded in that place, and what our responsibilities to that place may be.
You know, the responsibilities that we have with that is to look at it in a holistic manner. And before I started this this journey on environmental justice, because, you know, as we talked about how you're going to do this doctorate that you're going to get, and I said, I don't know anything about this, you know, and so I did some studying, and I thought I found something about Dr. Robert Bullitt and everything, and then I found out that, you know, what he has talked about, it is more than just environmental justice with them, because it's always perceived that Black people are not environmentalists. It's always perceived to be that way. And that's why I want to go ahead and change that up. I also want to change that up from the Dallas perspective. In Dallas, Texas, we have like I said, the haves and the have-nots. And if you go south of the campus, you find yourself pretty quickly within 5 to 10 minutes in the have-not section. In the have-not section, as you described, where Paul Quinn is at, there's a food desert, and yes, there's an ecosystem, but it's also a food swamp. Food swamp is in the fact that you don't have any stores to go to, but you have convenience stores to go to. And the only thing convenient about the convenience stores is the bad health that you get and that you receive with that. As an African Americans, for the most part, have the highest amount of blood pressure. But yet, if you go into a convenience store, you see all these pork rinds up there. Now that's all you get, pork rinds up there. You see all the soda. You see all the soda that you can get. Again, food deserts, food swamps. You see all the sodas you can get there. High fructose syrup in it. And then around the corner, you see a dialysis place. And you see that. And when you see that, you see kidney malfunctions. You see all of that, and all of that plays the man. That's effective in zoning, because that's all zoned there. And that's where we're at with this when we're bringing all this together. And I want to say this before I yield to you as well, that when we look at how we are going to change this, how we're going to change this and how we're going to make this better for future generations. It's more than just whether or not we have cooling stations in the summertime. Remember a couple of weeks back when everybody was freezing? Just wait till this summer, when you'll start hearing comments about people in the southern sector that are lined up going to the Martin Luther King Clinic because there are no AC units in their apartment complexes, because they live in an apartment complex that was built before they had central air. All this is projected in environmental justice and environmental racism as well. And those are the things I learned through all this. It's not just hugging a tree. It's whether or not you have clean air. It's whether or not you have fresh produce at the Minutes that's located in Fair Park. Those are the things that are holistic. As I said again, the term holistic. You got to take it all into consideration. It's not just about trees. It's about our whole entire environment.
I think that's so well said. And, it's certainly important to point out that environmental justice movements, both on the ground, but also in the academy, the scholars predominantly have arisen from communities of color, and particularly women of color have been the leaders at the forefront, really, making this new ground in many of these cases where we've seen issues exist for year after year, decade after decade. And it is these people who are coming to the forefront and saying no. And, I really appreciate the holistic comments that you were making about rethinking how holism works, because I think so many of our greatest environmental justice thinkers, they're really challenging us on kind of two axes. On one side, this artificial divide that has placed humans as separate from and above anything else, non-human life, the natural world, but that's something else. Human life is one thing and everything else fits a different category. But also, like you're pointing out, environmental justice activists have been very strong about pointing out how difficult it has been to get the traditional environmentalists on board for some of their work, in part because the traditional environmental movement, which is largely white, has defined their work around things like the wetlands, pristine ecosystems, places where humans don't exist. And on the other side, we see the urban environments. We see places where humans do exist. And I think one of the things environmental justice activists and scholars have forced us to rethink is to say, there is no division there. We care about trees, we care about forests, we care about all that, but not to the exclusion of the spaces that humans inhabit, that this is all environment. And to have this stark division between them misses the point that all of it is interconnected, and what happens in one place affects the other. What do you think about all that? How does that strike you?
Well, it does affect us all. The way that it affects us all is that, and you're right, first of all, about the division on it. I'm thinking as I form my answer is that the gentleman that was in Central Park that got the lady called the police on him because he was doing something suspicious. He was a black man watching birds in Central Park. Everybody knows black people don't do that. So anyway, that's the thought process that was said on that. But we're all in this, as the phrase says, we're all in this together, that there is an intersectionality of that. And when you put that into the form of the amount of dogs that are loose in the southern sector, again, which you talked about animals, and we talk about the environment as it affected with plants and trees. Well, we see that happening as well, because there are a large amount of dogs that are loose. And during the summer months, you'll end up hearing a story about some dog that was set loose that killed a lady, which happened about 2 years ago in South Dallas. You end up having that. So we do have the intersectionality of how we deal with this environment, not just in the urban environment, but also in the traditional environment of whether or not we're treating our animals correctly.
Yeah. And one of the things I've been really grateful to you, someone who came to Dallas in 2013, has been learning about the history, learning about what environmental justice looks like here, because this is not my home, or at least it wasn't for a large part of my life. For those who are maybe listening in, what should anyone know about Dallas? What is unique or different about the history of Dallas or the Dallas contemporary existence in terms of environmental justice? What do people need to know? What's going on?
Well, what's going on now is one of the things you had mentioned. We have several environmental justice groups downwind to south, and also we have other groups led by Marcia Jackson, Southern Sector Rising, which now have put forth, and these are led by women, which has put forth the environmental justice and also women's rights as well. And I think what's unique about that is the fact this is a disconnect we have as well, where African-American men, generally speaking, African-American men not into this. I mean, they're not. And I've interviewed several African-American city council people, and they're like, well, this is not what we do. And I guess they say that to me because I'm one of we. So this is not what we do. So I think this is the bigger point here that I'm getting at, is that we now have other organizations that have developed, and they see a way in which they can make a change. And then another thing I see about this, which is somewhat happening here in Dallas, because most of the individuals that run Dallas, the judicial system, are women, that we see that a lot happening in civil rights organizations, and in this particular case, environmental justice rights organizations. We see that women are coming to the forefront. And that should not be a surprise when women comprise 50% or not more than the population. And I think that's taken from a man perspective. It's like, I'm surprised. You shouldn't be surprised when women who are just as dominant in numerical numbers to be part of a leadership. And that's the best thing that I can see that's happening here in Dallas.
Yeah, and I appreciate you kind of pointing that intersectional piece out too. And I know Robert Bullard and a lot of the environmental justice writers point this out, that this nexus of especially race, class, and gender, and the way that all of that plays into how environmental decisions are made, who rises to the forefront of leadership movements, and all of that, that's such an important thing to tease out, that it's complicated. It's not just one thing. And I know you and I have had that conversation before too about representation, that it matters who's at the table making decisions about what zoning is going to look like, what, where environmental burdens and benefits are going to be placed. But that isn't the only thing. That doesn't solve the problem alone. So in terms of the way that your work is going, and kind of that question we talk a lot about, which is not just what's happening, but so what? Why does it matter? What do you think, what needs to happen here? How do some of these issues in Dallas get fixed? How have they already been fixed? We talk about Shingle Mountain, which got a lot of national news. What happened there? How do we understand what lessons do we gain from these stories to learn where we should be putting our activism efforts in next in order to make something happen?
Why does it matter is a very simple answer to that, because the future matters. If we don't do anything about this today, we are affecting the future. And as we often talk about in Dallas, we talk about what happens in the southern sector. If we don't do anything that's important today, we need to do something how it involves us tomorrow, such as the fact that when we realize that, and this goes much beyond in what people see when they see about Shingle Mountain, whether or not we have toxic shingles that are a mile high up in the sky, or whether or not we have water running in Sand Branch, or whether or not we have schools that can feed our poor. But we see the fact of it matters because in 20, 30 years from now, when we're all older and we have these SMU degrees, there's going to be 50% of the population, if not more, that are living in substandard housing, 50% or more of the population that'll be lining up to get water as they were last week at Mountain Creek Lake and the Dallas County Community College. That's what's important. It's not just whether or not we close down a plant. It's what we do after we close down the plant. Do we clean up the toxic shell that's there, or do we put something on top of it? And then once we do that, that is still there. Those are the things that matter. Because right now at Cadillac Heights, and this is what we talked about earlier, I know how people don't know what Cadillac Heights is, but in 20 years, you'll know where Cadillac Heights is at, because Mark Cuban has bought up a whole section of Dallas that 20 years ago was a toxic dump. And if not properly cleaned up and not properly mitigated, 30 years from now, we'll end up having people that are sick, and there'll be middle-class people, there'll be upper middle-class people that will be living on something that was toxic, and we'll never know the difference. That's how we change the future, by acting on what's happening now. And that's why it's important. And that's why it should matter.
Well, I think we need to move to involve others in this discussion, but I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to chat with you in front of an audience. I get the blessing of chatting with you often, but not usually in this sort of environment. So, I definitely would encourage everybody who's listening to follow Ed's work. It's vital. Anybody who has connections to Dallas, if you're living in Dallas, you need to know about these things. It involves all of us. And so you wanna get the expert opinion, he's got it. So I really appreciate that. And, well, I guess we'll turn it over at this point, but I'm assuming we can chime in too during the rest of it if we'd like to. So we'll be sticking around, but thank you so much, Ed. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Ed and Brad, those are powerful words for all of us. Thank you for leading the conversation, getting that started for us. As I've shared earlier, we now get a chance to hear from a phenomenal panel of alumni of the SMU Human Rights Program. Just as a quick note of format to our audience members, we do want to reserve the last 10 to 15 minutes of today's panel conversation to incorporate your questions. Those are things that you can put into the chat. If you're someone who's a little bit more shy and would like to email your question, I'll be dropping in my email address. You can share that with me that way. We're really eager to get your insights and feedback as our panel develops. I want to begin by introducing our phenomenal student moderator for the evening, Ash T. Ash is a sophomore at SMU, where he is studying human rights, photography, and environmental anthropology. On campus, he is the executive director for the Period Project, working to provide free and accessible menstrual products on campus. And he is also, at most other student events, the camera, documenting the innovative activism of his peers. This summer, Ash will be working with the Smithsonian Institute on To Be Named, an interdisciplinary project exploring the social and political aspects of naming land, looking at how language revitalization and visual work can aid in environmental and cultural justice for Indigenous communities. We're thankful to have you with us tonight, Ash.
Awesome. Now I will be able to kick off our panelist introductions, and I'd like to start by introducing Ucha Abba. Ucha is an urban planner interested in how planning and design can disrupt histories of inequality, provide access to healthy environments and food, build economic power, and support marginalized communities, building resilience in the face of climate change. She is also interested in how communities tell stories and connect to their land and histories. In her spare time, she is an organizer for Veggie Mijas, a BIPOC collective committed to supporting and building community among plant-based, vegan, and vegetarian BIPOC in Austin in a shame-free and decolonizing framework. We're happy to have you, Ucha.
Next up, we have Cecilia Emden Hands with us. Cecilia graduated from SMU in 2016 with a double major in human rights and health and society. As an undergraduate, Cecilia was a social impact career and engaged learning fellow. For her engaged learning project, Cecilia presented on the launch of Dallas as a smart city and the insights she gained by interning with the Dallas Innovation Alliance. She is now an advisory and communications consultant with the International Sustainability Consulting Group, Anthesis. She is currently based out of San Diego, California. Cecilia considers herself a lifelong learner and has participated in programs such as the San Diego Citizens Water Academy and the Climate Reality Leadership Training. She is currently a national fellow with the Environmental Leadership Program, ELP. And I should make a quick note of correction. Cecilia's graduation date with SMU is in 2016. Cecilia, we're super thankful to have you with us tonight.
Next up, we have Hibba Joffrey. Hibba graduated from SMU in 2020 with degrees in human rights and civil engineering. While at SMU, she was an active member of the Society of Women Engineers and the Muslim Student Association. She now works for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power in resilience and water loss management. Thanks for being here, Hibba.
Up next, we are lucky to be joined by Cindy Hua, who is a first-year PhD student in applied science for engineering at SMU. Her research interests center on how community-based STEM can impact learning patterns and enthusiasm for STEM. She's equally interested in how such learning can also become a tool for student voice. Outside of research, Cindy is an advocate for public education, working with the Eagle Scholars Program, empowering youth to become change makers for their community. She also serves as the chair of the Particulate Matter Education Committee with Downwinders at Risk, leading community science initiatives to address local environmental justice issues. Cindy holds a master's degree in sustainability and development from SMU and a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Texas at Dallas. I should also note that Cindy was a SMU Human Rights Fellow with us. If you happen to see Cindy around campus, I would encourage you to ask her about STEM education and zombies.
Awesome. And lastly, we have Raish Tomlanovich. Raish graduated from SMU in 2017 with a BA in political science and human rights. Afterward, he spent 2.5 years as a field manager for the Texas Campaign for the Environment, helping to organize large-scale public pressure campaigns on local and state environmental issues. In 2019, Raish joined the Legal Aid of Northwest Texas as part of the Community Revitalization Project, which provides free legal services to groups and organizations which work to improve material conditions for low-income communities. Thanks for being here, Raish.
Now that our wonderful crew of friends and alumni have been introduced, I want to pass the baton over to Ash, who will be moderating our conversation.
Hello. Yeah, so I'm Ash. I have the first part of this conversation has been phenomenal, and I'm really excited to follow up on that with a discussion with our panelists. I know some of you guys, and whether or not I know you already, I'm thrilled to get to talk more about the work that you guys do. So the question I want to start with, it sounds pretty simple maybe, but I think there's some interesting conversations that can come out of it. But I'm interested to hear what sustainability means to you. Everyone sort of has a different definition once they get in the weeds with this work. So I'll start with Cindy, but then whoever wants to jump in after that.
Sure, thank you, Ash. So sustainability, I think whenever we say that word, a lot of people have an image of, you know, the green trees and the landscapes and that sort of stuff. And that's one part of sustainability. The typical definition encompasses that environmental component. It also encompasses an economic and social component that people usually focus more on the economics, you know, all the money sort of stuff, and the environment, but less so on the social component, which is what I'm really most passionate about. And what that means in sustainability is not leaving anybody behind. So when we have all these really high-tech green technologies coming out, who is it really going for? Well, who is it really catering towards? Who has the most access to it? And I think that those are really important questions to ask if we're really truly looking for sustainability. If anybody would like to add a little bit more to that.
Yeah, the big thing when at Texas Campaign for the Environment, waste management was one of our big issues that we worked on. And the big thing that I always think about sustainability is just like sustaining what, right? Are you trying to make sure that a community, a group of people is able to sustain their way of life? Are you trying to sustain profitability for a company for a really long time? But coming back to what Cindy said, you know, for me, sustainability is equitable distribution of Earth's resources in a way to make sure that not only our generation, but a dozen generations down, there's plenty left. And so that's how I tend to think about it.
Thank you guys for those answers. With my next question, I think that our other panelists will be able to tie in more of their definition with this. But in public school education in the US, we typically don't spend much time talking about the environment or careers in sustainability. Environmental science is optional while biology and chemistry are required. So I'm interested to hear about when and how you guys got into this work and then what your work looks like now in terms of environmental justice and sustainability. So I can start with Cecilia for this one.
Awesome, thank you. So when I came to SMU, I was pre-med. I always knew that I wanted to do something with my life that was going to benefit people. I took some turns as normal in college, and I found a social impact fellowship actually through SMU, and that really opened up my eyes to all the opportunities to do good and also do business, or, you know, plan cities, all this stuff. So for me, that fellowship was really eye-opening, but it also took me to Paul Quinn College. They have a Big Bang event every year that is around collective impact. And that's where I heard Jen Sanders and Trey Bowles talk about how they were converting Dallas into a smart city. And that was really my first introduction into sustainability and resilience planning. And so as an intern for the Dallas Innovation Alliance, I got to learn about like what is happening in our city in Dallas and how the city is planning and preparing to mitigate climate risks.
I can go next. I think Ash, you brought up a really good point whenever you said that we aren't really exposed to that in K through 12, sustainability, environmentalism, and I'm an engineer, and so the kind of intersection between engineering and environmentalism, I really wasn't exposed to that probably until college. But I really just I was looking for some way I knew I wanted to do engineering. I knew that was what was the best use of my skills. And I was looking for something where I could apply my skills to something I was also passionate about. And so within my civil engineering classes, when we did hit topics that were about water sanitation, and equitable distribution of water, that was kind of like my light bulb moment of, hey, this is something that I really am passionate about and can apply my personal skill set and talents towards. But I think even now, we have more of a atmosphere where we are linking engineering and environmentalism and sustainability more so than we were like 10 years ago.
Can I add to the question? Okay, so for me, I kind of got into this as like a 12th grader, and my professor just being in an environmental science class and kind of the whole like the sky is falling, like this is your future kind of thing. And then I think I was like, okay, well, I have to address that. And then I think coming into the human rights program and kind of it's almost like this like dialectical relationship where the more I learned about justice movements and how like there are all these disparate impacts and burdens in the face of climate change and environmental justice, it felt like the more, and so I'm a planner by profession. And so the more I learned about the disparate impacts, the more I learned that like it's not by accident and that there are these very intentional forces that allow it. And so it just kept kind of, it felt like one was fine tuning the other. Like the more I learned about the environment, the more I learned about like justice work and like liberation movements. And then the more that influenced the way that I thought about the environment and environmental justice.
I can go next. I came through it, you know, Ed, you were talking about how a lot of the environmental movement is very white. I like to say I came through it through the Sierra Club angle, which is like, I like parks and I like my kids to have parks, but that generous.
Raish is taking a dramatic pause. We can just come back to him if his tech.
Valero facility. Oh, I just cut out, didn't I? Okay. Basically is I came in through it wanting to make sure that parks and mountains and beautiful places were protected. But the more I worked with Texas Campaign for the Environment, I mean, honestly, I was radicalized because I saw the type of communities that suffer under, you know, places like Houston, here in Dallas. And it really opened my mind to the larger picture. So that's how it really happened for me.
That's an interesting way of describing it, I think, Raish, because like everyone else, my K through 12 education did not encompass anything about sustainability or environmental justice or any of that sort. I ran into those topics much later during my years of undergrad through self-study. And where I found my passion was in education. So for a good chunk of time, I worked as a museum educator in the pro. It's like, how does that tie in? Well, I realized that, you know, as a biology major in undergrad, that there's a lot of things that you can take with biological processes that are almost parallel with how a city functions. And it's almost like seeing that sort of detailed picture, but whenever you zoom out on a macro scale, that there's a lot of things that are very similar in how some of the problems that we're seeing with environmental justice issues are concentrated in certain areas of the city, and just seeing that with how the cell is functioning, I don't know, my mind almost like blew. And so while I'm talking to these kids, you know, and explaining all these scientific methods and these scientific processes, it's like their eyes light up whenever you connect things that they see around them with, you know, community issues in science. It's like, oh, that makes sense. Like, I get why my teacher's teaching about it in class. And so I really found my way towards sustainability by when I inspire others, you know, for taking interest and enthusiasm with sustainability. So I would say through teaching.
That's so powerful. Thank you guys for sharing about that. And Cindy, I love that you find so much of your drive in this work in giving other people that like same spark that our panelists have described here, because that's such an amazing moment to have it click where it's like, oh wait, this is not only a thing that exists, but it's something that I care a lot about and I can actually sort of do something to address. And so on that note, I'm interested to hear more of the specific examples y'all have of how this intersection of human rights and the environment plays out in your own work. So Ucha, I know you mentioned this some in terms of your work with urban planning. So I'll start with you with maybe some concrete examples of what this looks like with all these different moving pieces with environmental justice.
Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Dallas, and I've moved to Austin for work. So I've been here for about 2 or so years. And I'll give this concrete example because I think it reflects what a lot of communities in, you know, large metropolitan areas have seen, which is that, like, because Ed's already mentioned zoning, but zoning plays such a massive role in where your quality of life outcomes, because essentially where you live determines your quality of life outcomes, and zoning impacts what can be next to where you live. And so, and Brad kind of mentioned like these like conservation movements. And so in Austin, you have kind of this twofold where Austin's impacted by redlining, like many cities have been, and those communities, because of, you know, it hasn't been that, we're not that far removed from what happened. And so the same communities that were redlined are the same communities. There's like a Berkeley study that shows that even now, a couple generations later, these are the same communities that are hotter, they're getting hotter, they're hotter, and they will continue to get hotter as climate impacts get worse. And they're also in the floodplain. So like none of this is by accident. And for many communities, they've kind of already been set up to be in these places where they experience disparate impacts and outcomes. But then also you have sort of this influx of like white environmentalists who say this land is valuable, you have to protect it. So like when you think of, well, we need, for some places, especially in Texas, like there's oil and gas, but where does it go? Where do we put these industrial buildings? And as Ed mentioned, in the city of Dallas, it's like all along the south, all along the Trinity River. And so there's sort of this like active and passive roles I think that planners have, and different groups who influence planning as a profession. So all of these different groups that come and lobby and say, we have to protect this spring, we have to protect these wetlands, this land is valuable. Well, then you kind of have to think, well, where do the industrial buildings go? And like, where do we want to maintain trees and tree canopy? Because I think some of this is thinking through like environmental hazards and who's burdened by them, but also like, what are the things people have access to in terms of like park access or food access or all of these different things that really, I think, bring that like quality, the like high quality to someone's life.
I think, Ucha, you've made a really good point, which is a lot of the environmental work that's been done over the last 4 or 5 decades has prioritized the air at a nice park over the air in South Dallas, which is an unfortunate, I don't think that was their intention, but that's how it's gone down, basically, right? And one big thing that I always think about land use, as well as like big systemic problems like climate change, is that whenever there's a huge national effort, like things like highways, who are the people that get stomped on to make it better for most people, right? And land use is one of those ways that has kind of developed in Dallas as well as across the country.
Thank you guys. Yeah, if anyone else has a example that stands out of seeing this intersection of human rights and environmental issues in your work.
Yeah, I think I have something to add. So in Los Angeles, and I think in a lot of cities across the country during COVID, so I work for the water utility in LA, and throughout COVID, they basically put a moratorium on shutting off water for customers that weren't able to make payments and pay their bills on time. And as we start to see, like the effects of COVID continue on, and we don't really know how long it will take for things to get fully back to normal and for people to be able to fully financially pay their bills. LA and the state of California has been looking into other new programs for how to kind of help and support customers who aren't able to make their payments, and not just go back to shutting off water at a certain date, but kind of instead creating even more new programs to make sure that everyone is receiving water, because water is a human right. And, just especially because of this pandemic, a lot of new customers aren't able to make those payments.
Yeah, I just add that climate change really is an existential issue, and whether or not we do something about it, the human race really is at risk here. And so I think that the connection between climate change and human rights is just so intimate that it's hard to separate them from another. And I think that we need to be moving towards it. So you connect it to the things that people care about, and a lot of people do care about people. So if you can connect the climate change, the climate catastrophe to how that impacts people, I think it opens up people's eyes, and it makes them take it a lot more seriously. It's not just polar bears or whatever your favorite animal or plant is. It's human lives and human suffering.
Yeah, thank you for that. Go ahead, Cindy.
Sorry about that. I was going to say that's a really great segue into a lot of the work that I've been doing with downwinders at risk. So some of y'all may be familiar with Shingle Mountain. It's been in the news a lot lately, and thank goodness that pile is gone. But I think that that's a really clear example of how human rights and the environment are very intricately related, if not just directly. Everybody has the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and live healthy lives. And so to have like 100,000 is the number that everybody quotes, a pile of shingles, next to Miss Marcia Jackson's house, next to just a neighborhood, it's a shame that had to go on for 3 years, and in order to convince the city that should not be there. And so, kind of like what Cecilia was mentioning, that a lot of these communities that are impacted most by climate change with things like Shingle Mountain also have the least agency and political power to get rid of those issues that are in their neighborhood as well. So it's very much intricately related to the human rights. But also more power to the people, because that thing is gone because of community organizing.
Let me comment on Shingle Mountain. I've known Marcia Jackson since 1984. We both used to be working mailroom in corporate America, and never did she ever imagine that she would be an environmentalist, a human rights activist. That's the intersectionality of how this has happened, the intersectionality of human rights and whether or not you can breathe, as Marcia is still suffering to this very day. If you go to Shingle Mountain and you see the remnants of what was there. You see that the shingles are still there to a certain degree and extent because it's in the groundwater. The groundwater goes into the Trinity River. Then it goes into another polluted stream. This is not just an isolated situation. Human rights is not an isolated situation of whether or not you can breathe. It's whether or not we all can breathe, because we all have to breathe air. We all have to drink the water, and water does not fully recycle itself. At some form or another, it's simply diluted. The toxins are diluted. They never just go away. And that's the intersectionality of human rights and environmental justice and environmental rights that we're talking about today, is that we never know when we have that opportunity to be in that intersection. But whenever we are in that intersection, we have the opportunity to act. And that's what Downwinders and that's what Southern Sector Rising is doing. They are now at their intersectionality and they are acting. And they're not just doing it for today, they're doing it for tomorrow. Just a couple of months ago, as I stated earlier, we all were cold. We were all cold. That's climate change. 2 months from now, we're all gonna be hot. That's climate change. But some people are gonna suffer more so. And then 2 weeks ago, ERCOT came out and said we needed to conserve energy on a day that it was relatively cool. What's gonna happen in June and July? And what's gonna happen on that day in which some kid will remember that how hot it was in July of 2021, and he decides to go to SMU and become an environmentalist because he wants to stop some unknown calamity that I didn't foresee when I recall the first Earth Day as a kid in elementary school. Nobody knew anything about climate change. Nobody knew about these things. But today, look where we're at. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a shame that Shingle Mountain exists to begin with, but it is a really hopeful thing to witness the mobilization around that injustice, and then thinking about its implications for the climate crisis more broadly and what lessons we can learn from that moving forward. And kind of on that note, Cindy and also Reich and anyone else that wants to give input on this one, I would love to hear more about how you've seen communities mobilize around environmental justice and climate change.
So with Downwinders at Risk, there's definitely been community mobilization and community action for 3 whole years. Up to December when they started moving those shingles out. That was the first step, right? It was just please get the shingles out. But that doesn't prevent that injustice from happening again. It takes policy change, right? So when we look at how areas and parts of the city are zoned, there are some parts that are zoned for industrial use. And a lot of what you see in southern Dallas is for industrial use. So in order to get these events to not happen again, we have to, rechange it. And so that's part of what Downwinders at Risk has tried to do, is work with the community to really re-envision how they can see their space. That will also go with an initiative that the city of Dallas is doing called Forward Dallas, to lead the rezoning efforts that are going on. So that's another step, just change the zoning so that it doesn't happen again. And then there's been a lot of questioning too of, how has Shingle Mountain impacted the health of the neighbors and the community that live there? And really what we have are a lot of assumptions, right, of what can happen with the health of the people. But what we have right now going on is an epidemiological study with community buy-in to be able to measure the long-term effect, what has happened with the community because of their exposure to different pollutants that have been exhibited because of Shingle Mountain. So that project is going along with Downwinders and Texas A&M with that epidemiological study for a couple years. And then it's also, well, now that the shingles are gone and we're having rezoning efforts and we have these health studies going on, what do we do with that space now that the shingles are not there? So it's remediating the space too. And so part of that re-envisioning of how Shingle Mountain, that area that used to be Shingle Mountain, and what it can be, it's going to be a park. And it's so exciting to be able to see that develop, you know, and have the community and the inhabitants be a part of that design. It's so powerful. And I really can't wait to see how that space just grows and develops over, you know, the next couple decades, next few decades, next 100 years, we'll see. But one thing is for sure is that we won't ever forget all the work and the effort that it took to get there.
I definitely want to echo Cindy and say work. How do you mobilize a community? It takes a long time. And, you know, it is amazing to see a big win on the board for a thing like Shingle Mountain, even though there's plenty of work still to do. I'll be honest and say that my own experience working to mobilize especially working class communities is difficult. Not only do you have to get them to agree that they have a problem, but then getting consistent buy-in and investment in the movement to change something is really difficult. When I was at Texas Campaign for the Environment, we spent a long time working on opposing an ethane cracker, which would have been about $8 to $10 billion, right, of investment, right? One of the biggest of its kind in the world. It was like half Exxon, half Saudi royal family oil company. And going door to door and just talking to people about this, most people are like, why should I care? Some of the farmers, you know, the company would come in and let's say a farmer has 10 acres of land. They expect to make 5,000 every year per acre, right? So that's like 50,000 a year over their whole lifetime. That's maybe, you know, I'm trying to do some quick math right now, but that's about like 50 years of working. That's something like $3.5 million over the whole course of their life. No, $22.5 million over the course of their life. But then, so like over the course of life 5, I was 50, that's like $250,000 per acre. These oil and gas companies would come in and offer these farmers $500,000 per acre. I'm not saying the exact numbers, right? But that's the proportion of incentive that you are working to overcome when you're mobilizing a community against a big facility like that, against climate change. And it is challenging. And the number one thing that I think we could do work on a big scale to change is like kind of connect the dots with people with solidarity about climate change. But I will admit that the number one tool that I often use in convincing people or helping them understand why it's not the best idea that you have industrial zoning next to your home is because it's going to mess your life up. What I call Nimbyism, right? Like that is probably unfortunately, the most effective tool we have right now to incentivize communities to even decide to mobilize against these industries. Many communities are okay with it. They get jobs. Sometimes the companies pave the roads for them. That's not always the case, but it is challenging, not only to help educate folks on what they could do, but that they should. And that's problem one. Problem two is these are marginalized communities. They don't have power. That's why the industry is going in next to their neighborhood. So the second part is like you can mobilize a community, but you got to give them access to power so that they can decide what that land use looks like, what that neighborhood looks like. I think Southern Sector Rising has done an incredible job by straight up shaming the city of Dallas for 3 straight years. And now they are not only a force to be reckoned with on environmental justice, but they're calling out city council members during this upcoming election to make that change. You know, they didn't just mobilize to unite on this issue, but they mobilized and they got power in order to make that change. So, you know, that's definitely what I would add to that conversation. It's hard to get folks started and then it's hard to get a win. And it's great to see it when it happens. but it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, thank you guys for sharing about your work. Sort of with this question of power and getting people to sort of realize the power they do have when they mobilize and gather together. Cecilia, I know you do a lot of corporate consulting about sustainability. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the barriers you face on sort of the opposite side of addressing climate change.
Yeah, so a lot of people feel powerless because industry and big business really is responsible for some of the most extractive and exploitive systems that we have that we need to address. And so that's why I have a job. I get to come in and basically make the business case for why businesses need to be addressing these things, how it's going to impact their reputation, how it's going to impact future profitability, how climate change actually could impact their supply chains, and the cost of not doing anything. People talk a lot about the cost of, building all the infrastructure we need, but the cost of not doing anything is exponentially bigger and also harms a lot more people. So I'd say that yes, it's challenging moving really big corporations to care about these things and do better. But at the same time, because they are the culprits, they have the power to also make some of the biggest changes and drive change. And we've seen a lot of that coming from investors. Now, a lot of investors are requiring companies to report not just their financial earnings, but also their carbon footprint. So there's a lot of movement around aligning with TCFD reporting. A lot of reporting also does include human rights and how people are taking care of their labor force. And I'd say, so we've got the investors, we've got the consumers, and of course, it needs to make business sense. So there's also a lot of synergies that can happen where by being more environmentally conscious, you can also have cost savings and other benefits. And so for me, like I said, it's the reason I get to have a job and go to work and all of that. And so it's more than a challenge, it really is an opportunity. And I want to see businesses moving in that direction way more, especially this is the decisive decade. That's what Anthesis calls it, my company. If we don't do anything in this decisive decade, we're kind of beyond the point of no return. And so the work I get to do is really pushing companies towards doing as much as they can. Of course, internally, there's a lot of politics. There's a lot of people who still don't get it. And that's why being able to link it to financial benefit helps. So the way that I've been able to justify some like diversity and inclusion programs is really linking it to this thing called an environmental social governance score. So the environmental social governance score, ESG, is kind of like a rating for how well companies are addressing these risks and opportunities. And so now a lot of investors are looking at those scores. So if you're able to tell a company, listen, you're not going to get money because your ESG score is really low because you have a lot of accidents in your labor, in your supply chain, they're going to want to act on that immediately. So that's the space that I play in every day.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's so valuable to have these different perspectives of the way that all these power dynamics play out in such a complicated issue. And it's interesting because we talk about this issue as something that's so complex, but something that's so pressing to address. And it's hard to understand the impacts who are looking straight at them. And by that point, a lot of times it's too late to really fully prevent them. And we've seen a lot of those same discussions around the pandemic. And there's even been memes about how, like online jokes about how the nature is healing because of the pandemic. And so there's even been like direct environmental ties with that. So Hibba, I know you mentioned earlier about moratoriums on shutting off water. And so that's been a direct conversation. So I'd love to hear from you more about the ways that the pandemic has maybe changed the way you understand your work, or what you think that might look like going forward as we kind of come out of this past year?
Yeah, for sure. So I do a lot of work with minimizing water loss, and it's interesting. So that usually occurs in a water distribution system from like leaks, or sometimes it's from like actual water, like meter tampering and water being stolen. But a lot of times it's from like old infrastructure, old pipes, or just leaks and blowouts, maybe from high pressures. But interestingly enough, like during the pandemic, overall LA saw a decrease in the number of leaks they experienced. And so obviously it's only been, they haven't collected enough data for us to know whether or not it's definitely due to the pandemic, but it will be interesting to see going forward if that trend kind of remains, if this is truly because we have different telecommuting patterns, traffic patterns, or if it's just some weird fluke in the last year. But in general, in terms of water loss in California, you really see a big emphasis on kind of focusing on minimizing water loss because it is such a water stressed region. And then there's other factors that go into it too, because of the topography in LA, and then even things like the type of soil in different areas. You'll see more water loss or less. Maybe an area will have more leaks than another area because of things like soil or land use. So there is a really big emphasis in California to kind of actively minimize water loss and proactively look for leaks, which isn't always the case everywhere. But I mean, it really should be, because water conservation isn't just a problem that places that experience drought should be looking after. It's something that every single city and every single utility should really be focused on, because I mean, it is cost savings. If you're losing less water, that's more that you have to distribute around the system. But it's also important to do environmentally.
Yeah, thank you. Has anyone else had things that have really stood out this past year in terms of the pandemic and how you understand your environmental justice work?
I think one thing that kind of stood out for me is that the biggest effects came from systemic changes, right? There's only so much that I as an individual can do about climate change, right? It's honestly not that much. But when our economic system goes through a radical shift, that produces the most effect, even though that effect was, relative to where we need to get, pretty small. And that made me feel a little bit better. I don't have to, like straws are bad, but that's not going to solve climate change, right? But I think the scale of our economic system and the scale of the problem is what really stood out to me, seeing those kind of numbers.
I just want to add that, so the sustainability field has been really emerging for the past few years, and a lot of us have been waiting for it to really take off. And I think 2020 was the year that it took off. A lot of people became more aware of issues. I think that there were a lot of really extreme weather events in 2020 that brought people's attention to this. And so now we see more job openings and people are hiring in this field more than ever. And so it's really exciting to see how the pandemic has actually really catalyzed action in this area.
I don't know that this is, I imagine for some people this is a connection that's being made, but I think for me, some of it was just thinking through the fact that like literally the pandemic is a collective issue. Like it's not just about like what you do in your actions, but they have impacts for other people. And I think often with environmentalism and especially climate change, there's some idea that like the US is just like either it's about kind of what Rach was saying, like your straw choice or like personal choices, but that also like the US doesn't have a relationship to other countries, that like you can somehow like insulate yourself and just maintain your own carbon impacts and your own like dealing with flooding or heat. So like, I think for me, there's just like an interesting parallel between people kind of really having to process their decisions in terms of impacting other people's health, but also thinking through like maybe this is also that similar process or like wall people run into in thinking about environmentalism and sort of the cities that we know that are coastal that really are not kind of accepting or even saying the words climate change.
I think from my angle, it's slightly different with how the pandemic, I guess, has impacted the AJ work that I do. So I'm going to come to the answer from like the virtual organizing perspective. Like it's been really interesting navigating that landscape. And even as a teacher, right? So it's like at first you try to do all the classroom activities that you've done in person, but then just try to like Zoomify it and like see if it works, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So it's getting creative with how you do that organizing or even that teaching in the classroom, right? So I remember when the pandemic had hit, like spring last year, that was right around when Earth Day, Earth Day 2020 was coming around too. It's like, well, how do we organize for that? Do we do anything? And so you just have to we had to get really creative, when the pandemic hit. So I remember a lot of our projects turned into mapping projects. And for Earth Day 2020, we were mapping, what is that, like arrows that to lead towards Shingle Mountain from the mayor's house. It's like, it's this way, pay attention to it. I remember that was our campaign last year. And then this year we have our EJ, our environmental injustice archive that's based on Dallas issues, chronologically archiving what's happened here in our county and just, memorializing that. So we've just had to get sort of creative with the work that we put out there in order for people to tune in to what's going on. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's been so interesting seeing the ways that people have approached their issues differently, thought about the work that they do in all kinds of different ways. Ucha, you talked about the ways that people have been understanding their sense of community differently this past year. And I did want to ask, so Ed and Brad started off our conversation tonight talking about ecological colonialism and the way that that plays out in Dallas's zoning and design. So I'm interested to hear more from you about your thoughts on decolonization and collective care as sort of one of the ways that we can sort of mitigate this going forward.
Yeah, wow, that's an awesome question. I think I'll answer this question talking a little bit less about my work and more about, because I think, so I joined Vegemias, as Neha mentioned, and it's a BIPOC collective that's really looking at environmental justice, food justice, but also kind of ways that we can create shame-free spaces where people can explore plant-based lifestyles. And so part of the reason I joined the collective was just seeing, all of the things that were happening with George Floyd during the summer, but then also kind of all of this constantly feeling like very isolated by like all the things I know about the environment, all the things I know about climate, and really starting to read a little bit more and learn that like a lot of things that are accomplished through a collective. It's not just like one person. And we have this like great man history, but often like behind each of those people, there's so many other people who are doing work and putting in hours. And so part of the reason I joined the collective was just because I was like, all right, well, I can read a lot of theory and that's great. That's important to know, but like I have to find other people to be in community with. And so that's one of the things that I think is great is like the Austin chapter, we're a little bit newer, but we have a garden that's in North Austin, and it's becoming a healing space, I think, for me and my co-organizer, where people can kind of just come connect to land and grow food. And then we've also kind of gotten a little bit more involved with food distribution, because I think that's another thing, that's a part of this collective, at least from my perspective, which is that like, I kind of have the angle that like, it's not pessimistic, but in acknowledging, I think a lot of people saw with the freeze that there's like this whole no one's coming to save you thing. And so I think a lot of that means that if you acknowledge or you don't trust the government or you are not waiting for some massive change to happen from the top down, then that means you have to build sort of a network of people and communities that you can kind of lean on. And so we've been involved with some like food distribution efforts that are being led by like Communities of Color United. And that's been, I think, a big thing that I've seen that's changed in response to the pandemic. It's just all of the free fridges that have gone up, which has been really awesome. I feel like this answer is a little bit long-winded, but yeah, I think for me, what's been really eye-opening and enlightening in my like journey through environmental justice and sustainability is just like how important that collective work is and how many spaces that can be built for people to just kind of heal and care for one another in the absence or in waiting for the state to kind of respond or do something.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's so powerful thinking about the ways that pockets of resistance not only exist, but then thrive and can do things to make environments more navigable for everyone involved. And one way that I see play into my experience as an undergrad at SMU is with the Human Rights Program. And as we're starting to wrap things up tonight, I would be remiss to not ask you guys who, I think everyone here has a connection to the program in some way, hearing about a really impactful memory or experience with the Human Rights Program, whether it's related to the work you do now or not. Whoever would love to start that off, go for it.
If you survived the intro class to human rights, that's inspiring, and it creates definitely like a community. That was Professor Halpern's class. But the biggest takeaway for me was a safe space to talk about hard topics, and everyone in that space being just so great, just incredible, and inspired to do good, not just coast. Those were definitely my biggest takeaways from the program.
I want to go next. So I have so many things that I'm thankful for the Human Rights Program for, and that I just can't name one. So one of them is the APIA pilgrimage across California. That's the Asian American Pacific Islander trip that we had in 2019, where we met different organizing groups and activists out there, but then also the HRF, the Human Rights Fellowship. I received extraordinary mentorship with Dr. Brad Klein, where I did lead STEM Z, the investigation of an undead apocalypse with a group of high school students at Booker T. Washington School of Visual and Performing Arts, where we promoted the exploration of like different STEM concepts outside of the classroom. And it was really cool to see all their experiments that they came up with, and it sounds like a far-fetched idea to a lot of educators, but Brad was really, really there supporting the work that I was doing. And here I am, getting my PhD. That's an extension of that, how these community-based issues, when you present them in really interesting ways, can inspire students to explore different STEM topics when they typically don't. So I'm so thankful for the Human Rights Program.
Yeah, I'd add Dr. Eric Bing's class, public health class, was really influential for me. We had to serve as consultants for the Dallas Police Department. My group won its case, and it just inspired me. I was like, this is the kind of work I want to do. Additionally, I'd say the civil rights pilgrimage, it's something you never forget. I think it really marked my life. And the biggest thing it taught me is like, show up and like speak up in the face of injustice. Going back to what Ed was talking about earlier, I think, was her name Marcia Jackson? You think about Marcia Jackson, she never intended to become this human rights and environmental justice advocate, but there was an issue and she spoke up and she brought attention to it for her community. And now it's something that we're here talking about. And so that was the biggest thing I took away from that civil rights pilgrimage, is people stepping up even when it's hard.
I have two things. My first is like, I really appreciate the community that human rights made, but in kind of like older students above you and younger students, it's just really something that like holds you together, that even after you graduate, or like while kids are still, or some people are still in school and you're graduated, it's something you like always have to talk about and always kind of brings you back together. And then my second thing is, I graduated last year in 2020. And so a lot of, the traditional things around graduation, we didn't get that. And like the civil rights pilgrimage, unfortunately, we weren't able to do that. But the Human Rights Program did such a good job of like doing special things to make us still feel like excited about graduating and part of the program. And so I'm really grateful that we had that experience, even though we didn't get that traditional graduation ceremony.
I'd say I'm grateful for there being a level of rigor without feeling like I was being, like the courses were weed out courses, especially like having half my coursework be in environmental science programs and the other half being in human rights programs. Like it felt like in human rights, I was being challenged without it feeling like, it's either you get it or there's the door. And I think the other thing was the civil rights pilgrimage, because I think it enabled me to like see myself in history, and really listening to people, I could kind of see a baton being passed from like a generation of people to like our generation. So that was really helpful for me.
Thank you guys for sharing those things. I know for me as an undergrad and for current students who are tuned in, but then also I know there's a couple incoming SMU students tuned in tonight as well. So I'm really glad that we're going to talk some about how this program has impacted our work that we're doing now. And as sort of a wrapping up question then, this is twofold. I know we had an audience question that was wondering about this as well. So maybe one piece of advice that you have about the work that you do, or environmental justice work in general, or even activism in general, whichever direction you want to take it, a piece of advice, as well as your thoughts for the future. I'd love to hear from all our panelists, as well as if Brad and Ed, you have anything to add for this last question. I know it's a big one, but whoever is ready to start, go for it.
I'll go. I'll echo what I said at the alumni panel. Work hard, take care of yourself. These issues are really important and honestly really overwhelming, and can be detrimental to mental health because they're on your mind all the time, because we have consciousness, right? So work hard, but take care of yourself. We got a whole life to do this work.
My advice is lean into your strengths and your passions. Graduating, I thought that I'd maybe made a mistake by not becoming an engineer because I couldn't install a solar panel. So I couldn't work in sustainability, and that's false. Everybody has a role to play, whether that be in the arts or design or anything that you are really good at, you can use and leverage to move this move this movement forward. So you can contribute to it in your own way and just be creative. You don't have to give up on anything that you really enjoy. You can find a way to incorporate it into this work.
Yeah, I really agree with that, Cecilia. I think that there's a lot of work to do on a lot of different fronts. And whether you want to do human rights or environmental justice, your path isn't going to look the same as everyone else's. And it honestly shouldn't. You should find, like Cecilia was saying, tap into your strengths, and don't worry about it if what you're doing doesn't look like, the human rights advocate next to you. You should be looking for your own niche and following your own path.
I think stemming from that, I'd say just because you feel like the path you're on isn't clear, or that there's not I think our professions are a lot more innovative than, say, if you were to say, I'm going to do this thing that's been charted and there's a history of that. But don't be afraid to continue moving forward. And that something that's helpful is just kind of being open and connecting with other people who seem to be on their own sort of separate but aligned path, because that's been super helpful for me.
I would say do your research and find your network and your people that you can lean into. So by do your research, I mean, well, for me with my work in downwinders, I'm thankful that I take care of the data. That's the bread and butter. That's why I don't get into a lot of arguments, right? Can't really argue with the numbers that are coming through the monitors. But yeah, do your research, because when these environmental justice issues come out, be well informed with what's going on, and stand your ground. And that goes in line with finding people that you can connect with, whether it's the people that are on the front line that are the experts on the issues, those that are living the lived experiences. Never forget that they're the ones that are experiencing, the issue in real time. So always circle back. So with whatever solution X company comes up with, or X community organization, at the center, it should be human-centered design whenever we're approaching any of these environmental issues. So that's my take on it.
Ed or Brad, did y'all have any closing words of advice, wisdom, something to carry forward?
Ed, please feel free to take it. I'll take us into the close afterwards, but please feel free, Ed.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm just so, first of all, I'm just so honored to be here. And I'm so honored to be, as I look at this Zoom call, the oldest person on here. And as I look at the young faces here, and Brad, I consider you young as well. I'm happy that there's another generation that's there to continue to fight. And that's where we can take this going forward in the future, is that there are people, as we all know, that took that civil rights pilgrimage, that took a step before we took. And now we are continuing that step that they took. And as you step forward as well, you will be in front of other people yet unborn that will be continuing to fight that you yourself is doing today and will continue to do tomorrow. So keep up the good work and keep the faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. I'll just end with a few words a little bit more broadly. A couple of questions that I get asked a lot. First question that I get asked quite a bit is, what do you think is the most important or pressing human rights issue that exists today? And I don't think there's one right answer to this question, but the answer that I always give is climate change. And that's the justification in my mind, at least, is that it's no other issue has the depth and the breadth that issue has. And not only that, the people who are already suffering most, people who are most marginalized, most oppressed, are the ones who will likely feel the effects and are already feeling the effects of climate change first and most. The need to take action on that issue. And the other question I get asked a lot is, what do people do with a human rights degree? What do they do with a human rights education? Well, I hope they're watching tonight, because I think this is a great example of exactly what you can do. We are so proud and so honored to have such incredible alums. This is actually the third event in the series. We previously in the semester, we had an event on human rights and law, where we had alumni who work in the legal field, lawyers and other related fields, to talk about the connections there. We had an event on human rights and medicine. And now we've had this event on human rights in the environment. And every one of them, we've had these incredible alums come forward to say, this is how I'm using my human rights education. This is how I'm applying this process of seeing the world to the work that I do. And even though the work looks very different, the way that people are approaching the work is very similar. And that's, we're so just lucky. I'm so lucky to come to work every day and to be able to work with people who are doing this work, not just trying to change the world in the future, but actually changing the world today. And so I want to make sure to voice a big thank you to all of our panelists tonight. A big thank you to Hope and Neha for helping to plan all of these events through this semester. They've done a phenomenal job in making all of this happen. And a big thank you to all of our students and alums across the globe, wherever they might be, whether they're listening tonight or not, for all the work that you do, for all that you contribute to this family that is SMU Human Rights. Thank you. And so just as a close, because I like symmetry, I thought, why don't we go back to another quote? I started with a quote from Winona LaDuke. Let's let her bring us out, because I think she can say it better than I probably could. And this quote, to give it a little context, she's speaking about Standing Rock. She's speaking about the Dakota Access Pipeline protests being led particularly by Indigenous peoples, but so many people across the globe recognizing the importance of water and environmental rights generally. And she says, and I think this is good advice for us to take out tonight for all of us. Standing Rock is not only a place, it is a state of mind, it is a thought, and it is an action. In a time when the rights of corporations override the rights of humans, stay human and remember that the law must be changed. For civil society is made as democracy is made by the hands of people, courageous people, and is not a spectator sport. So as we all say our goodbyes tonight and continue the fight, let us make Standing Rock our state of mind, our thought, our action, regardless of where we are doing the work and how we are doing it. It's a solidarity that connects us all, and we need to be in connection and support of each other. So thank you for all that you do. For everyone who's listening, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And until we meet again, we will say good night.
Bye, everyone.